Hello, and welcome back to the Alexander Society. This is a podcast where we discuss figures from history while carrying on the ancient tradition of our predecessors, getting a little schlitzed while we do it. I'm your host, Herr Dr. Professor Derek, joined by my friend, our resident Reichsbierkommandant, Tim. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing good. I understood no words of what you just said on titles.
I called you a Reichsbierkommandant, which is beer commander of the realm, basically.
Okay.
Oh,
How have you been, Derek?
I've been doing just fine. All of the days are blending together. I'm averaging 4 hours of sleep a night, and you know, very healthy lifestyle I'm living.
So, what are you drinking tonight, Derek?
So, what I am drinking tonight for our very special, but gonna end up actually coming out late because we're not great at planning. I did a little special combination for the topic today. So for the beer, I'm gonna be drinking. I think this is another Yeah, this is a local called uh, Co-op Ale Works, and I'm drinking their Oktoberfest.
I've heard of Co. I thought it was Coop, but I'm probably just wrong.
I figured it was co-op since that's what.
No, you're probably right. I was just letting you know how dumb I was. I thought it was Coop.
and then in combo with that for my shots, I pulled out the classic Western Sun vodka, with like the most Texan vodka that has ever been made.
I still have bad experiences with vodka, but it's one of the few flavored vodkas I actually quite enjoy still.
Take that combo as a little hint into what our topic will be today. What are you drinking?
I'm also drinking a local brew as I've been trying to get more Oklahoman stuff or like more just like, you know, stuff that most people don't try. I'm drinking Iron Monk's Oktoberfest actually.
Oh, still sticking with the Iron Monk.
And then I'm hoping to polish off my Scarlet Ibis rum that I've been drinking on.
So in this, our illustrious society, we abide by an ever-changing set of rules. Tim,
Number one is that every time Derek says something in German, we take a sip.
rule number two: every time I say something bad is happening to German people within the story, we take 3 sips.
And the third rule is every time Albizverein
Adelsverein.
Aldosavrine are huge assholes. Will do what, Derek?
We're gonna take a shot, and you're gonna find out what the Adelsverein is very soon.
I assumed it was gonna be explained in the episode.
So yeah, this is our special. We're doing a special German specific topic since it is Oktoberfest, and we will be celebrating.
At the time of recording, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get it out on our release schedule. Apologies.
And I thought about doing like a specifically Bavarian story because Oktoberfest is um, a Bavarian holiday. But I decided I wanted to take this opportunity. I guess we kind of decided together, but I wanted to take this up.
Well, I told you that we should do something in honor of Oktoberfest, and you were like, hell yes, let's run with it.
And so I wanted to take the opportunity to tell a story which is very near and dear to my heart. Our story does not begin in Germany, however. It begins in Paris. Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris on December 2nd, 1804. He had risen to the position of consul in the complicated and violent power struggles of the French Revolution, and upon ascending to his newly established imperial throne, he began overhauling the French legal system. I promise this is all going somewhere.
I assumed you were setting up for. You've mentioned it before that there's a very large German population in Texas. I was assuming you were setting up the reason why we had a massive exodus of German people into Texas.
Yes. Yeah. So Napoleon, he starts overhauling the French legal system. He establishes what's called the Civil Code of the French, which also comes to be known as the Napoleonic Code. And this new system, it was, like I said, it was complex, but in the simplest terms, it basically established the idea that laws could only be implemented if they were clearly documented and freely available to every legal jurisdiction in the country. And it also cemented the use of juries in criminal cases, as well as it also eliminated the ability for judges to pass verdicts or sentences on laws which didn't exist or weren't published.
That sounds like it's shooting yourself in the foot. You're handicapping your whole governmental progress system.
Well, it's basically it more or less how most modern legal systems operate. It's basically it empowers so it's empowering judges to be able to interpret laws to appropriately apply them to disparate sorts of situations, but it's also restricting their ability to convict people for whatever it is that the court deems it need people need to be convicted for, because that was actually so the whole point of this is the Napoleonic codes were trying to streamline and liberalize the judicial system, and the reason they were doing that was because they wanted to do away with the legal authority of the aristocracy. So like in the old aristocratic past of pre 19th century Europe, a prince could just pass a law and not tell anybody about it, and then judges in his uh, in his realm could enforce those enforce those laws. And
Okay. The way you had described it for some reason made me think that um, they weren't allowed to use their powers quite similar to how modern judges do it. While they aren't making the laws, they're able to, I guess, interpret them, in is the right word for it. How our Supreme Court decides, okay, is this what the framers of the Constitution would have believed given modern set of circumstances, or blah 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 blah.
yeah, yeah, and that is the way that it used to work in Europe, and that's what the Napoleonic codes were trying to fix. And it tied into like the French Revolutionary idea of like a national constitution and the establishment of like a written code, like a written framework for government that clearly outlines and describes laws and how they should work. And it specifies the actual powers of the court and what the extent of how they can interpret law, while also giving them the freedom to interpret law in a way that is appropriate to different kinds of situations. That's more or less how the Napoleonic Code, what the Napoleonic Code was trying to accomplish. Also, I just realized we forgot to do our start of the episode shot.
We did. Kampai.
Prost. Yeah, so that's what the Napoleonic codes are trying to accomplish. After defeating the Russians and the Austrians at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 and bringing the War of the Third Coalition to an end, Napoleon occupied what's now Western and Southern Germany to create what became known as the Confederation of the Rhine. And this confederation was just a puppet state for the French Empire. This confederation was compelled to adopt the Napoleonic codes as the model for their new judicial system. And in Germany, just like in France at the start of the revolution, there was a large number of young noblemen who were very interested in liberal ideas and reforms. Many of these wide eyed idealists on the east side of the Franco German border were very excited about the new legal codes being imported from Paris. One of these guys was what's called a Freiherr. So a Freiherr is it literally translates as a free lord or a free gentleman. And in English, like in English nobility, its equivalent is roughly like a baron.
Okay.
So this guy is a baron. His name is Karl Hartwig Gregor Freiherr von Meusebach. So Karl von Meusebach, basically. Karl was the heir to the village and the castle of Meusebach, if in case you couldn't tell already. That was a title that his family had held for almost 900 years by that point. So since like the 10th century.
Jesus.
Yeah, his family had been nobility since like the 10th century.
Was that is having a lineage, not lineage, would it be a dynasty that long normal for that region?
Um, it wasn't uncommon. There were a lot of noble families that could trace their ancestry back to about that time. Yeah, it was unusual for it to go back that far, but it yeah, they could trace their ancestry, and sometimes they kind of lied about, they kind of embellished their family history in order to gain prestige too. That happened a lot, but according to like actual historical research, the Meusebachs did control that their sort of land holding there. It was actually in like East Germany, even though they lived in West Germany. Um, but they can trace the Meusebach family's land holdings back to like the 10th century. So
Okay, so it's not an outrageous claim, is what you're saying.
right, it was a very impressive by the standards of the time. Like most noble families, you could probably trace their land holdings back to maybe like the 12th, maybe the 11th century. So it was a little unusual to be able to trace it back all the way that far, but wasn't unusual. And based on modern research, the Moisevaux did probably have that title for that long.
Nice.
Yeah. So yeah, our main character is coming from very old money in European nobility.
Okay.
Yeah, he was at so Karl was at the time an assistant judge of the regional court in the city of Dillenburg in the Duchy of Nassau, which of course was in Western Germany, where Napoleon now controlled.
I wouldn't have been able to figure that out unless you explained it to me. Geography is not one of my strong suits.
You wouldn't be blamed for not knowing where Nassau was or where Dillenburg is. Dillenburg, it's not a huge city even today, and it's the region that was the Duchy of Nassau. It's called something else now. So even if you were like better acquainted with geography, you probably wouldn't know right off the top of your head where that would be. But yeah, so Carl, he is an assistant judge in Dillenburg. He was married to another noblewoman, of course. Her name was Ernestine von Witzleben. And the Witzleben,
To me, Ernestine sounds like a weird first name.
it was German. It's old, like old person German name. If you ever talk to like an old person from Germany, a lot of them have really weird names, and like their parents had weird names, even like by like an English speaker's ear. Um, but yeah, so the Witzlebens were another ancient noble family with a long history and a reputation for specifically military service. So that's another very ancient noble line that our main character is coming from. By all accounts, Carl and Ernestine had a very affectionate relationship, and they bonded over their shared love of poetry. And they ended up sharing that affection with their children. Their first two children, a son and a daughter, both died in infancy. So, not off to a great start.
No, not really, unfortunately.
Yeah. The rest of their kids survived, though. Their second two were both daughters, Ludovine, born in 1808, and Caroline, born in 1811. And then they had another son who was born in Dillenburg, Germany on May 26, 1812. They named him Ottfried Hans. So we've gotten to our main character, Ottfried Hans von Meusebach. Napoleon was deposed in 1814 when Ottfried was two, and shortly after that, Karl relocated his family to the city of Koblenz in order to accept a position as a judge. And Koblenz, just another random city in West Germany. Ottfried grew up comfortable, of course. He's a child of noblemen.
Well, yeah, like I'm sure he had a posh life.
Yeah, he had a very posh life. He bonded with his family through singing folk music, and they spent a lot of time outdoors, where he developed a love for nature, which he would carry on for the rest of his life. His parents brought him up by the family motto, which in Latin is tenax propositi, which I don't know how to pronounce Latin, but tenax propositi is how it's spelled. So, and that translates as perseverance through purpose. And he very much internalized that phrase. It's something that he always came back to throughout his life. In Koblenz, Karl became friends and acquaintances with several big names in Germany, mostly Prussians, because Prussia was becoming the big superpower in Germany at the time. He made friends with Prussian generals August Neidhart von Gneisenau, who was a prominent military leader who fought against Napoleon, and also Karl von Clausewitz, who is now famous for being the father of modern military science.
How did he get that distinction?
He wrote a lot of books on how to organize modern militaries,
Okay, so like military strategy.
all facets of military stuff, not just strategy or tactics, but also like engineering, like how to organize an army, how to organize logistics, and how all of these different facets, even like the philosophy of war and how war relates to like politics and things like that. He was kind of the guy who invented that way of thinking about war, and his that basis is like the foundation for like all modern military science today.
Okay.
Like all of the stuff that they teach in like the US military academy today is has, if you go far back enough, has its roots in this guy's writing. They also became friends with the poet and philosopher Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who is one of the more famous Germans from history.
Interesting.
If you ever took like a modern philosophy course or anything like that, you probably learned about Goethe, or even like yeah, Goethe wrote more about he focused on a lot on like the idea of political liberty and things like that. Yeah, he was very much like a liberal of the time, and he was good friends with Otfried's dad. Karl, being a jurist by trade, was a very practical man, and he instilled that same sober attitude in Otfried. A lot of times he used quotes from like Benjamin Franklin in order to make his points, which was really interesting because Benjamin Franklin actually hated Germans. That's something they don't teach you. Franklin despised German people for some reason. I have no idea why, but like he called them roaches and rodents and things like that.
Damn. Franklin was on some of that real racist shit.
Yeah, he Franklin was from Philadelphia, which at the time of the Revolution had the highest concentration of Germans in America. So he would have interacted with a lot of them. It was probably just, like the same way like your most virulent racists in the US are from the South, where most black people also live. The same kind of thing. But yeah, Carl began teaching Ottfried about jurisprudence very early in life, and he ended up having like a natural gift for it. He was very good at like thinking of learning about laws and thinking about how they're applied and things like that. Though many minor nobles like Ottfried's father were vocally supportive of liberal reforms like the adoption of constitutions and the formation of national parliaments, the post Napoleonic period was an extremely reactionary and anti liberal period in Europe. In 1819, Karl accepted a new position as president of the Court of Review and a judge in the Superior Court in Berlin, which was the capital of Prussia. And when he got there, he was absolutely horrified by the scale of state repression and censorship against liberal ideas. And through that process, he became that much more of a staunch liberal, but he also became something of like a German nationalist, which at the time was not as terrifying as it is as it the connotation today with German nationalism. Back then, German nationalism was much more associated with like the idea of forming like a liberal government with a constitution and a parliament.
So before being nationalist was as even close to toxic as it is today for any country.
Right. Before nationalism and fascism got in bed with each other.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, Karl, he became a German nationalist. He began exploring ideas of how to unify the German states into like a single nation under a constitutional parliamentary system. And a lot of that ended up rubbing off on Ottfried as well. Ottfried and his younger brother, Karl Bernard, who was born a couple years after him, they attended a parochial school in the town of Russleben, which is another town in Prussia. And then when he was 15, he and his brother went to the Mining and Forestry Academy in the town of Clausthal, where they studied geology and natural sciences, which was beginning to, because of his love of nature, Ottfried was getting very much into uh, learning about rocks and plants and animals and things like that. He was obsessed with it till the day he died. In 1832, at the age of 20, he entered the University of Bonn, where he studied law and finance. And then later he transferred to the University of Halle. He was a very good student. His classmates admired him because of he had a very deep intellect. He was very thoughtful. He was very athletic. He was a really good swimmer. And everybody talked about like how humble he was. Even everybody loved him, but he never liked to admit that people loved him. That was kind of what his personality was. Yeah. While he was at university, there was another wave of crackdowns against democratic organizers and against like liberal literature and things like that. And of course, that that experience witnessing that happens because like students on his campus where he was going to school were like being dragged away and arrested for distributing literature saying like we need a national constitution and things like that. When he was 24, he passed the bar exam with flying colors, and he accepted a position as an administrative assessor in the town of Trier. And then 2 years later, he took another position as assistant judge back in Berlin. So now he kind of went to his preliminary like right out of college job in Trier, and then he moved back to Berlin where his family was and got a position as an assistant judge like his dad. He carried on his father's practice of hosting salons and intellectual discussions at his home in Berlin. Yeah, so Carl was really big on like inviting academics and other rich and learned people to his house, and they just talk about politics and philosophy and stuff.
Honestly, I would love to be able, like, I've always been a big believer, never be afraid to be the dumbest person in the room, because you're gonna learn if you are. Like, you'll just pick things up even if you're not like, even if you're lost, you're like, hey, I picked up this thing or two that I would have never learned beforehand.
Yeah, and some of these discussions were attended by guys like Johann von Goethe, which is like the stereo in Germany. It's like the stereotype of a smart guy. So yeah, that would have been like a crazy smart room. Probably also kind of like sheltered because everybody who goes to these things are rich because only rich people have time to go. But anyways, a lot of times at these discussions that Otfried would host, it often turned to political issues like the role of the state in nationalism and the debate over whether political freedom or national unity was more important. Those were common topics of discussion at the time. And Otfried, for his part, always argued that liberty was more important than any other consideration. If you didn't have liberty, you didn't have anything else. That was his position.
I can't really argue against it.
Yeah, I agree with him. That's 100% true. Disagree with him on like what form liberty takes, but like
Well, I would argue that, as cop out of an answer it is everyone has a different form of liberty in their own personal like mindset, and you have to find a balance of, okay, this is what enough liberties count for everyone to be happy, you know?
yeah, for the time he was in the right position. He was in the politically in the right spot historically speaking. But so during some of these salons and discussions, he became acquainted with a young noblewoman by the name of Elizabeth von Hardenberg. Elizabeth was quiet. She didn't often speak up during these discussions, but when she did, the things that she said were apparently so thoughtful and poignant that it always completely changed the tenor of the discussion. So, whatever it was they were talking about, she would give like one little comment on it, and everybody would immediately start changing their minds because they've seen it in a whole new light. That's how it's described, the way that she is discussed.
I would love to be able to be that kind of person.
Right. Otfried was very impressed by her, and the two of them ended up sharing a mutual attraction. He proposed to her in 1842, and the two became engaged, though he ended up becoming so busy with work that he ended up having to put off the wedding for a little bit. We're going to come back to Elizabeth later, so keep her in your mind. There were also discussions about political philosophy in the United States. The United States was, the US has only been a country for like 50 or 60 years at this point. It was a very young country. Otfried, for his part, he thought that the United States was a shining beacon of hope for political liberty in the Western world. But at the same time, he also criticized the US's hypocrisy in creating a government based on a philosophy of liberty while also allowing slavery to exist within its borders. So, already from the get go, which honestly, even amongst conservatives in Europe at the time, being anti slavery was not a very radical position. It was only a radical position in the United States.
I think we've kind of mentioned this before, but the U.S. was way behind on getting rid of slavery.
Yeah,
The South is a big reason on that. Pretty much the reason.
right. Yeah. It was during these discussions about the United States that he first became interested in what was going on in Texas. Texas had been a province of Mexico, which had a large population of American settlers. Those settlers had been invited by the Mexican government with the offer of cheap or even free land, but the Americans were disgruntled by the fact that they weren't allowed to own slaves. A lot of them still did because it was really difficult to enforce it because Texas was kind of the frontier of Mexico. But it was still illegal to own slaves in Mexico, and so that kind of pissed a lot of them off. And it also pissed them off that Mexico was so staunchly Catholic because most Americans were devout Protestants, and at the time, Protestant was synonymous with anti Catholic. So then in 1832, a Mexican general named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna overthrew the liberal government of Mexico. And then a few years later, in 1835, he abolished the federal constitution, which centralized power in the position of the president, which essentially made him a military dictator. This centralization of power led to rebellions across the country. Literally, every single state in Mexico rebelled. Every single one had a rebellion. And of course, that included Texas, where a coalition of white settlers and Federalist Mexicans who opposed Santa Anna, they got together and they formed a new government that they called the Republic of Texas. After over a year of fighting, the Texan general Sam Houston and his army defeated the Mexican army at the Battle of okay, little controversy over the name of this battle. In Texas, Texans call it the Battle of San Jacinto.
Okay.
It's in Spanish it's supposed to be San Jacinto.
Americans once again screwing up Spanish.
Yeah, but I'll just call it the Battle of San Jacinto because that's what every English speaker knows it as, but I still don't like it. But, anyways. But yeah, Sam Houston, Texan army, defeated the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto. They captured Santa Anna in the process, and they forced him to accept Texas independence. And that is how the Republic of Texas became an independent nation. That whole war was called the Texas Revolution. The Battle of San Jacinto had just happened when Otfried graduated from university. And the Texan revolt against the dictatorship of Mexico was a really hot talking point in liberal German intellectual circles in the 1830s. Everybody was wondering, like, will this project be able to survive? What does its political system look like? And there were already a lot of Germans that were over there who were reporting back, like, not only is the Republic of Texas like a beacon of liberty, but the state is also so empty that you could buy hundreds of acres of land for really cheap.
Did they ever have like I know Oklahoma's famous for it because ours was the biggest formal one, but was there like a land rush in Texas?
Not really. The Texan settlement operated on a land grant system. So there was no like land run. You couldn't just run out and claim a plot of land. You had to go before the Texas government and its land agents, and you had to buy a parcel of land on, and it would usually be really cheap, but you'd be buying it on the condition that you would be surveying it and settling it within a specified period of time. So it was a way of um, bringing in immigration by selling it for cheap, and also it was also a way of ensuring that it wasn't just used for land speculation. So you physically
I mean, the land run was actually kind of quite dumb the way it happened. There's a reason why we still have a bad name because of it, the Sooners.
Yeah, the land run was a disaster. It was a bad idea from the start. Hundreds of people died for no reason. um, but yeah, so that's what Texas is doing at the time, and the reason that they're doing it with this model is because they're trying to attract as many settlers as they possibly can because they are really desperate to build up an economy. And to have an economy, you have to have people producing stuff, and to produce stuff, you need people working land. So that's what they're that's what this land grant system is trying to do.
Makes sense.
So Otfried was hearing about all of this stuff going on in Texas, and he was also learning about lots of German academics were writing books about not just the political system of Texas, but also the ecology, the geography, the flora, the fauna, all of the stuff he was really interested in. And the idea of Texas really caught his imagination. He had this like very idyllic, picturesque sort of concept of what Texas was, and it really kind of pulled at his heartstrings and kind of kind of kept like pulling his attention back over and over again. It was never very far from his mind. Despite that, though, at the for the moment, he was more concerned with the situation in Germany. His main priority was like, well, how do I use my career and my skills to further the cause of political freedom for the German people? That's what that's what he was trying to accomplish.
I mean, it seems like I don't know if noble's the best way, but he couldn't have spent his. There are worse than. That's one of the better things for him to do. I guess is the way I want to put it.
Yeah, I think he's not a bad guy in this particular. He has his heart really is in the right place, and he genuinely has a deep love for his country and for the German people, and wants to see Germany and its people freed from the bonds of ancient institutions and hierarchies and things like that. So, despite the fact that he kept trying to focus on Germany, the topic just kept coming up. New visitors to his home and new discussions kept coming back over and over again to the Republican project in Texas. And with every conversation, he became more and more intrigued.
What was the Republican Project?
The Republic of Texas.
Okay, that makes more sense. I was so confused. I was like, the Republican Project? That sounds something very specific. What the? But you just mean that Texas is a republic in that sense, yeah.
No, I mean like yeah, the project of creating a republic in Texas. That's what that means. In 1841, he was appointed as the Bürgermeister of a rural town called Anklam. And a Bürgermeister is it's just a mayor.
Okay.
So, but it's Germany, with like it's Germany in the 1800s. They didn't elect their mayors; their mayors were appointed by, in his case, by the Prussian government. And so he goes to this rural town of Anklam in order to standardize and modernize the town's bureaucracy and tax collection. And he wanted to take this as an opportunity to kind of reshape Anklam in the image of his liberal ideals. But he wasn't quite able to go as far as he wanted because he kept getting hampered and stifled by
We also need to take a sip for Amklum. That's German.
Anklam and Bürgermeister.
Yeah. I totally forgot about that rule. I'm not gonna lie, because I'm used to you saying stuff I don't understand.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So he's trying to modernize, he's trying to liberalize this town's administrative body. And that would involve like modernizing like the court system. It would involve changing the way that property laws work. So, but the problem was all of his superiors were very conservative, and so they kept putting the kibosh on a lot of the ideas that he had. And then on the other side, the townspeople were not willing to give up a lot of the old practices that they used in their town because they were so used to the old communal form of farming, which is like a medieval sort of a like a medieval peasantry sort of approach to farming where the land isn't owned by anyone in particular. You just go out and you farm it. And
Was he trying to introduce individual land ownership, or what? Okay,
yeah, yeah, part of his reforms was to try and break up and parcel off this common land and uh, and grant it to each individual head of household within the community. And none of the farmers wanted to go along with that. They just wanted to stick with their old communal system.
interesting.
Yeah. And honestly, I'm more of a fan of like a communal approach to organizing labor. What Otfried was trying he was trying to do that because he thought that tying a person's labor to an individual plot of land that they specifically owned would increase productivity, and it would also streamline the the taxation of each individual household, because each household could be specifically associated with a specific plot of land and the specific amount of output that's created from that land.
I, I mean, it makes sense from a practical sense, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it would just make for easier paperwork. But he couldn't quite get that far because again, none of the townspeople that's a lot more difficult and sounds like a lot more of an administrative nightmare on their side. Um, but nevertheless, he did successfully reform the town, and he did such a good job that he received a commendation from the Prussian government, and it was obvious to every like he people were already like headhunting him for promotions to different political appointments within the Prussian state. It was really obvious he had a really bright future ahead of him, most likely in either law or administration, but potentially even as a statesman. Like these were the same kinds of positions that Otto von Bismarck, the really famous prime minister of Prussia who united Germany. This is kind of where he was starting out too. Actually, at the same time as this, now that I think about it.
Interesting.
And his friends were really excited about this because they hoped that if he could get a really prestigious and influential position in Prussian politics, he could help it push the kingdom in like a more liberal direction. But this experience in Anklam really bothered him. His the he was the reforms that he was trying to do, they didn't go as far as he wanted them to, like I mentioned. And he was afraid that in the future, even if he did get to positions of power and influence within the Prussian government, that just the reactionary culture and climate of the Prussian state would kind of force him to compromise on his ideals and would kind of hamper his ability to push Prussian law in a more liberal direction, like people were kind of imagining for him. He thought that getting involved at those levels of government would get in the way of sticking to these ideals that he held so dear.
Which typically it does.
Yeah, he was running 100% right about that. If he'd actually made it that far, he would have sacrificed all of his beliefs in the process. I firmly believe that that's just how political power works. But and here's the thing. Here's one thing I really respect him for. He gives up his career. He just walks away from it because he at the same time this is all happening, he's also thinking about the fact that there are a huge number of Germans that are fleeing from this stifling political climate in Germany and trying to build better lives in what they see as like more enlightened areas of the world. So at this time, there have been two what are called emigration societies. And emigration societies are basically like these like joint stock corporations which are formed with like a certain they're formed with like a base of capital, and they use that capital in order to send groups of people abroad to settle in a new place, to work the land in that place, and to use that labor to uh, pay dividends and increase the the price of shares for the company. So it was kind of a mix between like an ideological like an ideological nationalistic sort of attempt at like spreading German influence across the world, and also like a very capitalistic sort of business venture.
I mean, considering their shit stock and shares are very capitalist, yeah.
Yeah, so far there had been two immigration societies that had already been formed in Germany by that time. One of which had established a community of Germans in Guatemala in Central America, and another one in New Zealand. Both of those countries to this day still have like a noticeably large population of like people descended from German immigrants, which out of context would like Germans in Guatemala doesn't make any sense if you don't know the context to it. But yeah, right. But yeah, so all of this stuff is happening. And then also in the United States, it had been through an immigration society, but there were a huge number of German immigrants going over to the US. Like at the time, they were having debates in Congress over whether or not German should be like a co-official language of the US besides English because there were just so many Germans there and it was such a commonly spoken language. Any Anyway, so yeah, all of this stuff, all of these German immigrants going abroad, he began to wonder if he's meant to go follow them, if his efforts and his energy and his skills might be better put to work, working towards liberty for his fellow Germans around the world instead of just in Germany itself. And so, against the wishes of his friends and to the shock of the Prussian government, he resigned his post and began exploring opportunities to immigrate to America. And like a bolt of lightning, his brother Carl struck him with some amazing news. So, Carl told him in March of 1844 that a new organization called the Adelsverein was on its way to land in Texas. Is that another sip for us?
Yes, it's German, but as soon as they do something shitty, it's a shot.
You're right. So, back in 1842, a group of German noblemen had met in the city of Mainz to form an organization called the Verein zum Schutze deutscher Einwanderer in Texas, or the Society for the Protection of German Immigrants in Texas in English. Another sip.
Another sip.
And and this organization was headed by a man named Count Karl Castell. His title, it was Karl von Castell. Like his actual title, like his what would have been like his last name, the title he held was the title of Castell. It was called Castell twice. I have no idea why, but that's his family name.
What is a Castell?
His family name was Castell. It's some weird thing with like
That's so weird.
there's a certain way that noblemen can get married in a certain situation where their line becomes what's called the cadet branch of their family. And so,
Cadet branch.
yeah, cadet branch is just it's a semi-independent family that's still part of a larger family but is kind of separate. I don't know. Nobility is stupid. Titles are stupid. But it's a thing.
Agreed.
Yeah, so this organization, it's headed by a man named Count Karl von Castell. I'm for the duration of this story, I'm going to be calling this organization the Verein. That's the word I'll use.
For Adelsverein?
Yeah, yeah. Verein is just German for society.
Okay.
So we'd be the Alexander Verein is what the podcast would be called.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so the Verein was also called the Adelsverein, or the Nobility Society, like I mentioned earlier. The Verein organized a purchase and a land grant from two land agents from the Republic of Texas government. These two guys were named Henry Fisher and Burkhard Miller. Fisher and Miller sold them 3.8 million acres of land in the Texas Hill Country at for $11,000.
Is that period money or Modern money.
That's at the time. Even then, still fucking dirt cheap. That's cents an acre.
It's kind of baffling to think how cheap they used to sell stuff back then, and it just shows you corporate greed today.
Yeah, and just the fact that there's so much less there's the country does the U.S. doesn't have a frontier anymore, so we don't just have like these huge tracts of quote unquote empty land, but they weren't actually empty. But that's another discussion. But just enormous, just millions and millions of acres of just empty land that the population of America at the time just couldn't fill all of it, and so there's just such an abundance of land that it was all dirt cheap. But yeah, so 3.8 million acres of land for $11,000, and the Texas government gave them a license for colonization, which would expire in August of 1847. So they had to have these land grants surveyed and settled by August of 1847. I'll bring it up again, but kind of keep that in your mind. There's a date. There's an expiration date on that.
Um, how how big was that window? Like how many years did they have to get it settled?
It was they moved their first colonists to Texas in 1843, so about 4 years.
That feels really short. Not gonna lie, for how long transportation took back then.
Yeah, I thought so too. So I did just from reading what I picked up. It took about 8 weeks to get from Germany to Galveston, and then from Galveston, it probably took about a week and a half or 2 weeks by wagon to get to the land grants. And then once they were physically on the land, like that counted. So
So they didn't have to be set up or anything. They could just be there.
it set up to build a house, have a little bit of livestock, and be prepared to start planting when planting season comes around. And that was considered settled.
Okay.
So in July 1844, the first Adelsvereiners landed at Galveston under the leadership of the Vereins Commissioner General, this guy named Prince Karl von Solms-Braunfels. Amongst the first wave of settlers was my great 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 grandfather.
That that's an awful lot of greats.
Oh yeah, a guy named Friedrich Heinrich Heitkamp. My distant grandfather was a bachelor from Holzminden, Germany, which was in the Duchy of Brunswick. He was I don't know what he did in Germany, and I don't know what he did after he got here, but I know that got he got to Texas in 1844. He got married the next year, and he had a bunch of kids. And now I'm here. Yeah, but you can see why this story is pretty important to me.
Yeah, I totally
In no small part because our main character is going to become the probably one of the main reasons why my distant ancestor didn't just die of spinal meningitis in the mud on the coast of Texas. He plays a big part. I would give a lot of credit to this guy for the reason that I am sitting here talking into this microphone today, which is so that's why this story is so important to me.
understandable.
So the settlers, uh, they they landed at Galveston. They traveled to Indianola, and then from Indianola they fanned out all across the Texas Hill Country, setting up towns and ranches. Prince Karl founded the town of New Braunfels, which he named after his own home back in Germany. The title that he held, he was the Prince of Solms-Braunfels. And New Braunfels would serve as the capital of this new colony, which they they christened it Neues Deutschland or New Germany, which that's another sip.
I've never understood the concept of naming something new such and such.
I guess I know it's like a way to pay homage to like
I understand that, but I've always been more of a name and honor than name directly after kind of person. But I've always been an anti-junior person as well. Like I think naming your kid the same thing as you is kind of douchey and pretentious.
I know that it's an ancient thing. There is a town in Spain called Cartagena, which the name Cartagena comes from its Latin name what the name of the town was 2,000 years ago, which was Nova Carthago, which is Latin for New Carthage.
So it's been going on forever, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. There's a precedent for it.
Well, I'm not surprised, to be honest. Like it's one of the easiest things to do, and does not surprise me in the least.
So yeah, so they call the colony Neues Deutschland, but the name doesn't end up sticking. I'm not going to use it, and nobody ever calls it that. They call it the Hill Country. Some people call it like German Country. So yeah, New Braunfels, that town that just got founded in our story. That's where my distant grandfather. That's where he settled down, and it is still where my dad's family remains to this day.
Nice.
Yeah, I still have family there. There's a bunch of hike camps down there. Yeah. Otfried's brother Karl reached out to Count Castell in October of 1844 in order to explore the possibility of joining the Verein. They found, Otfried and Karl found that Castell was not only very excited by the prospect of Otfried coming and joining, but also offered Otfried the position of Commissioner General.
Was that a military, or was like
No, it was the guy in charge of the colony, like actually in Texas.
okay? So kind of like the boots on the ground, not general, but a governor or whatever.
Basically like he'd be running the administration of the colony.
Okay.
Which that position at the time was already held by Prince Salms, the Prince Karl of Salms Braunfels. Not only that, not only were they offering him the position would come with a tidy yearly salary of like $1,000, which was a lot of money at the time.
Oh yeah.
And they would also give him a stipend for scientific research.
Sounds like he had it made.
Yeah, this was a really good offer. It was suspiciously good.
How so? You're alluding to it. Explain.
Oh, we'll get to it. It was bad. But at the time, it was such a good opportunity that it was too good to pass up. He couldn't possibly pass this up. He was going to be able to go abroad. He was going to be able to serve his fellow Germans like he wanted to, and he was going to see this place, Texas, which had caught his imagination so hard already.
I mean, from what you've already told me, it sounds like was he. It was the perfect time to move down there if you got the opportunity. To be honest.
Right, yeah. He knew that he would be making a really radical change in his life. In his eyes, the Republic of Texas represented the ideals that he sought to build in Germany. He saw Texas as a place where freedom was available to any man who was prepared to work in order to keep it, and where like rank and title of nobility were all thrown away in favor of labor and industry. That was his idea. And so he didn't want to enter this liberal society with like still tied to the inequalities of the old world in Europe. And so he relinquished his title as a baron. So by this point, he was being referred to by his father's title. He had carried on the title as well. He relinquished his title as Freiherr. So yeah, he relinquishes his title and he bought his $2,000 share in the Verein and he traveled to Mainz in order to meet with the other noblemen. He signed his contract, naming him Commissioner General on February 24th, 1845. He had to discuss all of this with his fiance, because remember, he has a fiance.
Mm-hmm.
They agreed that once his 2-year obligation to the Verein was up, so he had his contract stipulated he had to stay as Commissioner General for at least 2 years. Once that was up, he would return to Germany. He would marry her, and then they would move back to Texas together.
So would he not lose his land if he moved back?
Nope, it was still the deed and title to the land would still be under his name, even if he went back to Germany. Because once you get title to land, you still own that land, even if you're not physically on the land. So he'd still be able to keep it if he ever took a trip back to Germany, which that's essentially what was happening, what would be happening. Because at this point, he was determined if he was going to go to Texas, he would be cutting ties with Europe and he would be staying in Texas. He'd already made up his mind about that.
I mean, can you blame the guy? It sounds like everything that he was told he was getting was made for him. Like he was getting a life of not necessarily luxury, but like it sounded like everything he wanted and needed at the time.
Yes, that it's everything that it fit perfectly into what he wanted to accomplish with his life. He would have he would be able to explore frontiers, live in a society which valued liberty over, well, ostensibly valued liberty over like your last name, and he would be able to help serve his fellow Germans in the process. It was perfect for him. It's everything he wanted. So yeah, Elizabeth was 100% on board. She was like, hell yeah, let's do it. Let's move to Texas. Let's make a new life. But he would have to finish his term as Commissioner General first.
How come Elizabeth couldn't just go during the term?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly why it is that they decided this specific way. I imagine it has something to do with he knew that he'd probably be really super busy and wouldn't have time to set up like a family.
It also could be that because he was getting what it sounds like he was getting his trip over there the first time paid for, he may have not been able to bring his wife because it wasn't paid for. Like it was
Oh, he would have been able to pay for her to come along too. He had the money to do it.
okay.
Even if the Varine would have paid for her to go along too, like they were paying with him. That was part of their whole setup, is that if they were paying for you to go, they're paying for your whole family to go. But even if they weren't, he had the money to pay for it. For some reason, I'm not sure why, but they decided he'd finish his thing, come back, marry her in Germany, and then they'd go back to Texas together. So he set off by ship. First, he traveled to Liverpool in England, and from there, he set sail across the sea to the New World aboard a steamer called the Cambria. He decided that with a new life, he needed a new name. And so he took the anglicized form of his middle name, Hans, and he began introducing himself to people on the ship by his new name, John Meusebach. And so that's what history knows him as. That's what I'm going to be referring to him as, John Meusebach. His first time stepping foot on North American soil was when his ship stopped for repairs in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is in Canada. He was then dropped off at Boston, and from there he traveled to Pittsburgh, where he boarded a ship which took him down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers down to New Orleans. Finally, by ship from New Orleans, he set foot on Texas soil for the first time on May 1st, 1845, when he landed in the bay at Galveston. Before he had even left Galveston, he got to work. First, trying to get an understanding of the state of the colony. So the first thing he did was he went to the Varine's agent in Galveston to get an idea of what's going on. What he found out was that Count Castell had not been completely open about the state of the Varine, and John might have been bitten off a little bit more than he could chew.
So what? How was it not in the state? Was it like had no one started? Had was there open rebellion? What was up?
Basically, the entire thing was a financial shit show.
Oh, okay.
Uh, Prince Psalms had completely bungled the colony's finances. Just he just hadn't been keeping records on land deals and supply acquisitions. So he was using funding, the fund, like the startup capital of the Varine, and buying supplies and buying land to set up like outposts and things like that the uh, on the way to the land grants, and he just hadn't been keeping track with any of them, and so the, there are just no records of it, just no records of any of it. That guy I mentioned before, Henry Fisher, who was one of the men who had sold the Varine their land grants, he had actually been commissioned by the Varine to procure supplies for the colonists that had arrived, that first wave, which was about 430, I think it was 439 colonists. He had not provided a single bit of provisions so far, even though he had been given $11,000.
So he He basically took the money and ran.
He didn't run. He was still working with the Varine. He just hadn't gotten any supplies.
So he just didn't do his job.
He just didn't do his job, but for some reason they were still working with him. I couldn't figure that out. It's one of those weird because all of this information is coming to us through like letters, like back and forth from Texas and Europe, and I haven't been able to completely like parse out what exactly it was that he was doing instead of buying these supplies. But he just had $11,000 of the Varine's money and wasn't doing anything with it.
That's so weird. He had to have done something with it that he wasn't supposed to, and it just he was too ashamed for like it to reach the history books or something.
We do know that Fisher had aspirations about getting into Texas politics. He had already tried to become like good like buddies with a lot of like prominent Republic politicians at the time, and so they speculate that it probably had something to do with that, though they're not exactly sure how. But yeah, I don't understand it. But he just wasn't doing his job. So the settlers were finding that they didn't have any tools or the materials that they needed to begin farming. And because of all of this stuff, the Varine was already just at the start on the verge of bankruptcy.
Sounds like the perfect way to start a new colony,
Yeah, yeah. John has walked into a very bad situation.
to say the least.
Yeah. John arrived to New Braunfels a week later. He was prepared to meet Prince Psalms and get himself acquainted with the administration of the colony, see if he could pick up any information that Psalms had learned so far. On the way there, John took in the landscape of Texas and he immediately fell in love with it. Which me too. The Texas Hill Country is the most beautiful area of the planet that I have seen. Admittedly, my limited experience, but the most beautiful landscape that I've ever seen. Just just rolling hills, fields of wildflower like Indian brush and bluebonnets, covered in like dense forests of live oak that grew like 30, 40, 50 feet high.
See, I'm more of a like a mountain and a forest guy, like, mainly two together. But I don't know why. I can't tell you.
Yeah, I feel you. I guess I also am kind of biased because this is a place where I was born. It means a lot to me. But yeah, so as he's riding by horseback to New Braunfels, he's just taking in the scenery. It it's almost just like he pictured it in his mind, reading about it in books and talking about it at his political discussions, and it's really grabbing him.
Okay.
But then he arrives in New Braunfels and he's immediately snapped back to reality. He arrived at the Varine headquarters and he discovered that Prince Psalms was already gone. The print Yeah, he just left. He got sick of dealing with the situation and he left back to Galveston and made his way back to Germany and he never set foot in America again.
That's so weird that that happened, because I feel like if that normally when that happens, someone's running away from something, you know? And the fact that we don't have anything to say he was running away from
Well, he was running away from
his responsibilities, but I meant like he did something stupid or like beyond just like, oh, he didn't get the provisions ready, blah blah blah.
he was just a rich kid from Germany arriving in a frontier where he had to build civilization from scratch, and he just wasn't his romantic notions of what he was getting into didn't jive with the reality of the situation, and so he did the rich kid thing and just used money to extradite himself from the situation. That's basically what happened. But yeah, so Prince is gone, and what John found instead was $20,000 in creditors' notes and no financial ledger keeping track of them.
So clarify, the colony owed that money, or was oh someone owed them that money?
The colony owed $20,000 to
That's what I assumed, but I just wanted to clarify.
Owed $20,000 to a bunch of different local credit, local loaners, people loaning them money on credit, and none of it was being kept track of. So that meant that John's first priority would have to be tracking down all of the debts and that had been accumulated and figuring out how the hell to pay them back. So John decided his first objective would be to increase the population of the colony. In his figuring, more labor would increase the amount of output, which would increase the amount of trade, which would therefore create more revenue for the Verein so that they could start to pay off their debts. This would also fit into another goal that he had in mind, which was more ideological. He wanted to start integrating German immigrants into wider American society. So, what the Verein's original intentions were was to just carve out a piece of Texas and make it part of Germany. They didn't want Germans to go there and be Americans. They wanted to go there and make a new Germany.
They wanted to have a new center of control for more Germans to populate, basically.
Right. And yeah, they wanted to establish like a new zone of influence for like a prospective future German nation. And they wanted to um they wanted to make money off of it. They wanted money coming
Well, no duh.
money coming from a colony back to the fatherland. That was the idea. And none of that included integrating into American society, which would have defeated in their minds over back in Germany, it would have defeated the whole purpose. John, on the other hand, he thought, well, the first priority of this whole venture is to ensure that these people have are able to make a living and take care of themselves, and also to ensure that they have political freedom.
So he was worried about the people, not about the mother country.
Right. He was worried about the people, but the rest of the Verein were worried about, uh, well, the first of all, the money. Second of all, like the idea of what the colony represented. And that's really going to be the main divide between John and the Verein going forward. So the Republic of Texas would end up being annexed by the United States in December of the same year, 1845.
I bet that put a lot of issues with Germany's goal.
Um, yeah, actually, it completely defeated the purpose of what they were trying to accomplish. But there was still money to be made, so they just kept chugging right along. And so with Texas being annexed into the US, he hoped that the colony would kind of benefit from inclusion into the American economy, like the wider American economy. He began putting out notices inviting Americans to settle on Verein land grants, which again, the Verein's trying to make a new Germany, a place for Germans in the new world. Bringing Americans in defeats the purpose. But John doesn't care because he's trying to make sure that the people in the colony are taken care of.
Which is the right thing to do.
It is the right thing to do, yes. Because Meusebach recognized that it would be an economic disaster for the colony to isolate itself from wider Texan society. So this situation is the start of the rift between John and the Verein. So John set to work organizing the colony's finances. He had some he had to somehow find a way to retain credit with local loaners so that he could continue to buy food for the colonists, because it turns out they had arrived too late in the season to plant their first crops.
Of course.
So they had to retain credit while also keeping the creditors that they already had off of their backs, at least for the next year when they could actually start planting and start making a profit. On top of that, he had to keep up the morale of the settlers who were already suffering the consequences of the Verein's failures. Most of the settlers were living off of a single meal of cornbread and bacon a day, which was barely enough energy to keep up like the daily tasks of building stuff. The homes that they were building were usually just cobbled together from whatever materials they could find in the countryside. Usually they looked like shacks with like grass thatch roofs.
at this moment, because there wasn't any money for building materials, and there weren't any tools for getting any other sorts of like materials. Like they couldn't cut down large trees, they couldn't mine out limestone to start building, to make bricks or anything. And then on top of all of that, all of these Germans who were so used to the colder climate of Central Europe had absolutely no idea how to deal with the humidity or the heat or the mosquitoes of Central Texas. And then John, another thing he had to do, he had to distance the colony's finances from Henry Fisher, which seems, like fucking duh. So he started to distance the colony's finances from Henry Fisher, who he knew obviously was mismanaging the Vereins' funds. And he began sending letters back to the Verein in Germany requesting that they break their relationship with Fisher. It wasn't all gloom and doom, though. The big thing that they had going for them was that they hadn't had any problems with raids from local native tribes.
Is there any particular reason why they didn't have that, or with just luck?
I think a big part of it is luck, actually. I'm really not sure. But in the first few months that John was there, several of the local tribes have had approached New Braunfels and had been looking to establish trade and like diplomatic relations between the Germans and their respective nations. The local band of the Waco Nation, they especially seemed very eager to meet the new arrivals. And so John ended up inviting the Waco chief to a stately visit in New Braunfels. And so they met for like a peace conference on the banks of the Kamal River. And during this meeting, the two groups agreed to a perpetual peace. And they agreed that there would be no reason for the Germans or the Waco to have conflict with one another for after that. And and it kept, like, that agreement stood. They never fought with each other. Also, at that meeting, the Waco gave John a name in their language. The name they gave was Mabekwo Sitomu, which translates as chief with burning hair.
Was he a redhead? Why did they call him?
Yes, he was a his hair was very, very bright red. Like, people said that it shined like reddish gold in the sunlight. It was so bright red. And it was the first red hair that a lot of these native people had ever seen in their lives, and so it just completely blew their minds. It This is actually going to be a recurring theme. Anytime he interacts with native people, they always like holy shit, this guy's head is on fire, look at his hair. Just every time, it's crazy. So, beyond finances, one of the top priorities on his mind was the remainder of the land grants which the Verein had purchased. Because what they were settling on right now, actually most of the settlement wasn't actually in the land grants. So, I'll explain. The bulk of these grants lied northwest of New Braunfels and had so far been unsurveyed and unsettled. And the reason for that was because when Henry Fisher had organized the purchase with the Vereiners back in Germany, he had failed to mention that the land he had sold them lied within the territory controlled by the Comanches. Now, American colonizers already had a long history of brutal conflict with native peoples, as we all know. But the Comanche were utterly unique compared to other nations that they had encountered. I've seen some historians compare the Comanches to like the Huns, but the Comanches were really unique in that they were basically they I mean they were literally referred to in history books as the Comanche Empire, because of they controlled like this specific bit of land that was completely impenetrable by outside forces. Ostensibly, it had been that guy Henry Fisher's job to go and survey this area, which is smack in the middle of Comanche territory, was all of this land that had been bought by the Verein to settle. But Fisher had so far refused to risk entering Comanche territory in order to do the survey. And so, for the moment, pretty like all of the German settlers are outside of the land that the Verein actually owns. Their settlements are in stuff that they had to buy when they got there. They weren't part of the original grants. So, like New Braunfels.
That's kind of weird.
Yes, it's a very weird situation that could only happen in this place and time. Uh, so, John didn't have the luxury of leaving all of that land alone. That land and the potential profits of working it were the dividends that the Verein was they were the dividends that all of the investments that had gone into the Verein were made. The only way to pay off the initial capital was to get that land working. And the deadline for settling that land was coming dangerously close, because if they didn't have 6,000 families settled on that land by August of 1847, that was the actual number they needed. They needed 6,000 families by August 1847, which was just over a year away at this point. The Texas government would revoke the grants, and all of John's efforts in straightening up the Vrein's finances would be for nothing. So he's in a bit of a stressful situation right now.
I can imagine being super stressed at that, not gonna lie.
Yeah, it's if you think it's bad now, he only has a little over 400 lives resting on his shoulders at this moment.
Oh, good God. Imagine how much more he has to go through. Jesus.
Yeah, it's only 400 people at the moment. It's about to blossom to about 4,000.
Damn, that quickly?
Yeah, it happens all at once, too. So he set off on a preliminary expedition to the border of Comanche territory, which that territory was actually called, the locals called it Comancheria, which is a really cool name that I wish we still used for the region. So, yeah, he sets off on a preliminary expedition to the border of Comanche territory in the fall of 1846. One night, he and his party stopped to rest in an area by the I think it's Pedernales River. And as they sit, John just kind of started looking around. He took a breath. He was looking just at his surroundings. And what he saw, the soil in this area was rich. The wildlife was abundant. It was absolutely everywhere. They were literally living off of bear. During this expedition, they just shoot a bear and eat it for days. And that's how they were surviving.
Just a bear per day for 400 people?
No, this is just the expedition. It's just like 15 guys.
Okay, it's like, how the hell do you get a bear to feed 400 people?
No, though a lot of the people back in the colony are kind of living the same way, because for some reason the only things they have in abundance are liquor and guns. So, anyways, so yeah, he looks around. The soil of this area is rich. The wildlife is abundant. The trees are tall and sturdy and perfect for building. To him, he was seeing for the first time the Texas that he had read about in the books back home in Germany. In this spot by the Pedernales River, he decided that this place would serve as the site of a new town. He'd initially set it up as a way station. It was halfway between New Braunfels and the actual land grants, but he envisioned it growing into a bustling city in its own right, like a little slice of German industry, but with all of the liberties and prosperity of American life. He named this new town Fredericksburg in honor of Prince Frederick of Prussia, who was the highest ranking nobleman in the Adelsverein and who had actually called on John to wish him luck before he departed from Berlin for America. So he was Frederick the Prince of Prussia, one of the children of the King of Prussia, was a close friend of John's. And so he named this town Fredericksburg in his honor.
So if you take out the nobility, he named it after his friend.
Yes. The first citizens of Fredericksburg, about 120 Germans from New Braunfels, arrived on May 8th, 1846. And one of Meusebach's associates, another member of the Verein named Dr. Friedrich Schubert, was appointed as the town's governor. When John returned to New Braunfels from his preliminary expedition, he discovered that he had received two letters from Count Castell. The first one said that the Verein had approved the immigration of 4,304 new settlers to Texas.
Holy shnikes, Batman.
Yep. And they were all coming at right around the same time, which it was what the colony needed. They did need more manpower. But then he opened the second letter. See, he expected the second letter would be to inform him that there was extra funding coming from mines that would help pay off the colony's debts and to help pay for these new arrivals to help set them up.
There was no extra funding.
There was actually extra funding.
Okay, it was probably horribly undervalued.
It was the $20,000 he needed to pay off the existing debts. Nothing more than that to pay for the supplies that they would need to transport 4,500 people to new homes. Yeah, and this will be a constant source of criticism against the Verein for the rest of the 18th century or the rest of the 19th century. Like people who talk about the Verein, they're like, yeah, they sent 4,000 people across the ocean with no money to get them started. That's something shitty that the Verein did. Prost.
Cheers.
So the German settlers were becoming more and more upset by the day. Understand, as they have every right to. I'm just imagining my however many greats grandfather. I wonder what he was doing in this situation because he's probably living in a hut, pissed, just absolutely fucking fuming. And he would have been married by this point too, which is funny.
Well, did the rest of the settlers, like, I guess that's the way to put it, know that they weren't getting extra funding?
No, because they had signed contracts, and the contract stipulated that the Verein would provide for them until to help them get settled in, help them get some startup capital, which included cattle and tools for them to start planting, and they would take care of all of their food needs for the first year until they could get the first harvest in. And none of that was happening, and they had no idea why.
Yeah, I bet you that they were pretty freaking pissed. Yeah.
Yeah, so they were fucking pissed. And despite John's assurances that he was working to get the funding from Germany, they were starting to resent his position as the Verein's chief executive in the colony. In one incident, a settler approached John and began demanding his funds and started calling the Verein a scam. John, who was extremely stressed out at this point and was starting to become pretty irritable, took this as a personal insult against him and pulled out his pistol to shoot the man.
Oh, wow.
He stopped himself before he pulled the trigger. He composed himself. He put his pistol away, and then he had a cool-headed, calm discussion trying to answer the man's questions as best he could. In another incident, there was a mob that gathered in New Braunfels that were demanding their funds, and they were threatening to threatened to blow up the town's ammunition store if they didn't get their money.
Damn. They was pissed.
John once again talked it out and diffused the situation. He was really good at that.
Okay, can we take a moment to appreciate how strategic of a talker he must have been to have talked that many people down already?
Yes, he is. That is his greatest strength in this entire situation. He is an expert negotiator. He's a good administrator. He's good with bookwork. He's a complete realist. He's able to assess any situation completely divorced from bias or ideology. And he's a good negotiator. He's good at talking to people and getting them not to do what he wants, but getting them to calm down and look at a situation rationally like he is. That's his that's his great quality. That's like I'm trying I like to imagine him in a position of as like a world leader. Like if something had gone different and he'd somehow found himself the leader of Germany or of Prussia, and just the absolute skill and dexterity of his ability to negotiate would have changed human history had things been different.
I don't disagree from what you've told me. I admittedly I don't know enough to probably say as authoritatively as you do. To be fair,
Yeah. And let's be honest. I'm talking out of my ass, but that's it's what it from my perspective that's what I see. Um
and we're talking about what is basically a speculative history. We can take it to the path that we logically think. We can't really see the nuances that would happen in real life.
yeah. So and then there's another situation. There's a man named Leopold von Evansky who came to John's doorstep, just in front of his door at his house. Came from sunrise to sunset every day for 14 days and just stood in front of his house yelling at John to give him the money he was owed for 14 days straight.
I mean, at least the guy was dedicated, for fuck's sake.
He was just mad. He's gonna come up again. That particular guy. He comes up twice in this story, and they're both just batshit insane reasons.
Well, I mean, you've got to be a special kind of pissed to go up to a guy's house and just shout, not turn to violence or whatever, just shout and scream at him for 14 days in a row.
Yeah, it eventually does come to violence, but we'll get to that.
Well, I'm sure.
Yeah, so things were becoming volatile, and the colony was it was turning into a ticking time bomb, and it would only become worse as new waves of settlers began to trickle in mid 1846. That second wave of immigrants that the Adelsverein sent. So, desperate for new funds and constantly being rejected by the Verein, John decided that his only hope for motivating Castell to approve more funds was to put pressure on them from back home. He had this guy, his DH, his initials DH Kleiner. He had this guy Kleiner, who was the Verein's agent in Galveston, the guy he had met when he first arrived. He had Kleiner draft a letter outlining the conditions of the settlers and how the noblemen of the Verein had failed to keep their contractual promises of funding to the colonists. Then he sent this letter to every major newspaper in Germany,
Holy shit.
and all of them published it.
He lost his fucking mind.
And it worked. There was this enormous outcry in Germany against the Verein. Everybody was angry and upset that the Verein had allowed the people that they had shipped over to the New World to live in that kind of depredation. And it was hugely embarrassing for the Verein and especially Count Castell. And so on September 7th, 1846, a special agent from the Verein, his name was Philip Capus, arrived with $60,000 of extra funding from the Verein.
That still kind of seems low with them sending thousands of more people coming.
Yep, it was low. John actually did the math. He estimated that he would need $200,000 minimum in order to meet the colony's needs at that point.
Lovely.
Yeah. Um, just for some perspective, the startup capital for the Verein at the very beginning when they first founded it was $80,000.
So what, they've spent probably like 200, 300 before they sent this?
Yeah, up to this point, they've spent at least a good $100,000 so far.
And they still hadn't seen any ROI?
Right, because despite all of this spending, they still didn't have enough money to actually equip. And at this point, it's still like they they have to wait a year to actually start planting. So it's going to be like 2 years before they can actually start getting ROI, which is another like very poor planning from the Verein.
It's very poor planning.
So this guy Capus, Philip Capus, the agent sent by the Verein with the money, he wasn't just there to oversee the transfer of funds. He was actually there on a secret mission for Count Castel. The noblemen in the Verein were already becoming wary of John.
Of course they were.
Yeah, they saw his constant letters demanding funds as a threat to the profitability of their venture.
If you don't properly set up your venture and properly fund it, you're not going to get an ROI. That's what they need to realize.
Yes, this was entirely their fault, and John is the only person keeping the organization afloat at this point. It's just because every day for like 12 to 14 hours a day, he's doing constant work to keep uh the ledger balance, basically. That's his entire life at this point. And so, but from their perspective, they're sending more money to the colony and not seeing any back. So, from their perspective, John looks like he's starting to look a little bit like a con man to them.
Yeah, well, if they would actually look at it objectively, they would have known that they were fucking up.
Yeah, none of them are in Texas. None of them know what the situation's like on the ground. And then the article comes out, published in Germany, completely embarrassed the organization. And so they started exploring the possibility of ousting John from his position. And Capus was sent to spy and report back any malpractice which they could use to justify sacking him.
Did he find anything?
Ultimately, no, but a lot of other stuff happened. But John is an immaculate administrator, and he's too much of a goody two shoes to ever try to do anything that wasn't above board. He was too ideologically committed to his own sense of honor to ever commit malpractice.
Few men have that kind of willpower to not fuck themselves over.
All of this stuff going on. To make matters worse, the Mexican American War began in April of 1846. The bulk of the fighting was in southern Texas, which is where the colony is.
That's rough.
As these thousands of new immigrant arrivals are coming, there are
Do we want to count that as something bad happening to the Germans since it's happening in their...
oh yeah sure, why not? That's 3 sips, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So all of these German settlers, as they're arriving, they're stopping at this newly established port um, south of Galveston called Karlshafen, which is this the name of this place. Karlshafen is it literally translates as Carl's Haven, or more specifically like Carl's Harbor.
That's something in German.
That is something in German, yes. Mm. But it was named Carl's Haven in honor of 3 members of the Verein who were all named Carl.
I guess Carl's just a generic name at the time.
Yeah, it's a very generic German name, but it was
I would have never imagined that the name Carl was German, though.
yeah, it's the German form, it's the German version of the name Charles. Charles is the English version. So, a bunch of these German settlers were arriving at Karlshafen, which was smack in the middle of the combat zone, meaning that and and as they're arriving, they don't have anywhere to go. They're just living in like tents with little to no food. And because there's no they can't afford wagons to transport them and their stuff to New Braunfels or to any of the other settlements. And so there's just thousands of people living in this giant tent city at Karlshafen, which is smack in the middle of the combat zone. So all of these starving homeless people, fresh off of an eight an 8 week trek across the Atlantic Ocean and North America, and they're caught in the crossfire between the Mexican and American armies while they're starving to death.
That's such a clusterfuck. It's not even funny.
It's such it there is no excuse for why this situation has to be happening except for just the sheer oblivious just indifference of the people who ran the Verein. So no, there were no German settlers who were ever directly affected by the combat itself, but for the duration of the war all the way through 1848, that entire period coincided with the arrival of the bulk of the German settlers to Texas. And so there's just these thousands of people packed in at Karlshafen while these armies are crisscrossing back and forth over the countryside, sucking up access to supplies and what few roads actually existed at the time, right at the moment when all of that was so desperately needed. And then at this tent city at Karlshafen, disease started to spread amongst the settlers. Obviously, that's going to end up happening. But the big endemic disease that began to spread was specifically spinal meningitis.
How does that spread? Like I don't know it. I don't know anything about spinal meningitis. So
I don't either. I should have looked it up, but everybody in the in Karlshafen was getting it, and as the few of them who could travel like started to kind of trickle into New Braunfels, they were starting to spread spinal meningitis to the other settlers who had already arrived. So by the end of 1848, it's estimated that between 800 and 900 Germans in Texas died of either disease or malnutrition.
damn.
8 to 900. I saw some people as
I'm not gonna lie. I kind of assumed it would be more, not just because of this, but because of how underfunded they were and all the other circumstances they've been dealing with.
right. Yeah. At this point there's a little under or there's supposed to be a little under 5,000 people total in the colony. Almost 1,000 of them are gone. So about 1/5
Shit.
are are dead by the end of 1848. The bulk of those were amongst the immigrants who became trapped at Karlshafen. Um, it, that's something bad that happened to Germans.
Sip.
Fuck. Normally, like, I'm always horrified when this kind of stuff happens to people.
As morbid as it sounds, it might have been for the not literal best, but with the funding they were getting, that might have helped alleviate stress there, is the only consolidation I have.
It did not, because it could have been like 100 settlers and they still wouldn't have enough money for it.
Oh, lovely.
But the thing, I'm always like very disturbed and saddened when stuff like this happens throughout history, but I get a very different feeling, like a very unique feeling about this, because I know that like these people almost became part of like the culture that my heritage, my these people.
Well, just think of it this way. Slightly different path, and you wouldn't be here if your ancestor had been one of those.
Yeah, if Friedrich Heitkamp had caught spinal meningitis and if it had killed him, I wouldn't be here. And that's and it it feels so awful to me.
It's so weird thinking of historical events being so divorced from them and not being able to truly feel the ramifications, then realizing, hey, I might not be here if an extra few people lost to that or yeah.
Yeah, and they never, because in the end the German colony in Texas, it does become successful. and it does become very prosperous. It becomes one of the richest areas in the state of Texas in the 1800s. And it's out of that prosperity that the the Texas German heritage and culture is born, that heritage that I'm from. And to think that all of these people, just by the sheer incompetence and disinterest of a bunch of rich assholes, all of these people died and never got to be a part of that, is very emotionally impactful to me. But it, yeah. Anyways, so obviously, all of this stuff that's happening, the hostility of the colonists towards the Varine is is now boiling over, and it finally exploded on December 31st, 1846, New Year's Eve, 1846. Henry Fisher, the land agent who sold the grants to the Varine and was commissioned to procure the supplies with the Varine funds, but but had failed at that and had ended up being cut out by John. He wanted revenge on John, and he also wanted power. Henry started discussing the problems that the colony was facing with the residents of New Braunfels. And during these discussions, he had been starting to sow discontent with John's leadership.
I'm kind of surprised it took this long. I'm not gonna lie.
This has been just about a year so far that John's been in Texas. I I I loaded this story up with the bulk of this story is going to be about the Adelsverein, which in John's life is only about a period of 2 or 3 years.
So this is a pretty tight story, is what you're saying.
Yeah, this is a pretty tight timeline we're talking about. But yeah, so Henry, he's starting to make people direct towards their anger against the Varine towards the top agent of the Varine in the colony, which is John. Henry helped some of the most important citizens in town draft a list of demands to present to John, which included access to the lands that were promised in the land grants that were promised by the Varine, uh, payment of the funds that were promised by the Varine, John's resignation, and then the last one, the transferring of administrative power over to Henry Fisher, which made it obvious to John that, oh, this was Fisher's doing.
I mean, if someone specific that would benefit from it is the one that's unanimously picked, it's kind of dead obvious. If they're like dubious, oh, we'll elect a new person, and it just so happens, it's probably not as obvious, but like you can still read between the lines. At least historically, I don't know about in the moment.
So, December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1846, a mob of 116 people arrived at the door of John's home and forced their way into his house while he's eating breakfast. They present their demands, and when he refuses, he doesn't show any. He's his same like the famous sort of stature that he presents. He's very stoic, he's very cool-headed. He always talks very calmly and in a diplomatic manner even when his life is at stake. But in this situation, doing that only pisses the mob off. They want to see him scared. And when they see him not showing any fear towards them, they start to get angry.
Well, of course.
So, as he's trying to talk them down, they start shouting, "Hang him." And somebody at the back of the mob grabs a rope and starts tying a noose.
They hung him, didn't they?
They did not.
Oh?
John, again, completely unfazed, or at least not showing that he was phased, just continues to talk. And he just keeps talking. And eventually the crowd calms down and they start to listen. And over the course of a couple hours of just him talking and addressing questions from the crowd, he finally managed to convince them to disperse. And so he literally dispersed a lynch mob just by talking to them.
That's hella impressive.
They were prepared to murder him, and he was able to talk them down. Fisher ended up fleeing the colony, and he would never have any major business in the colony again, at least not until after John left his position. But he was not seen in John's company again after that. He was never close. He could not have any business with the Verein while John was still in power. So by this point, John Meusebach was an exhausted man. He was getting very little sleep. He was irritable. He was constantly becoming sick. He was suffering from body aches, and the daily tasks of managing an underfunded colony full of starving, helpless people was just too much for him. He had become completely disillusioned with the Verein and with its leadership, who prioritized nationalistic idealism and profits over the lives of the settlers and the reality of the colony's failures. And so he tendered his resignation.
I mean, that's probably the smartest thing he could do.
Yeah, that's the only thing he had left. So he tendered his resignation. He put it in a letter. He sent it off in January of 1847. But it would take a couple months for it to get over to Europe, and then it would take a couple months to come back. So in the meantime, he had one last responsibility to fulfill. He believed very much in completing what he started, and he believed he still had a responsibility to the well-being of the German settlers. And so he had to do this. It was a dangerous task, but it was one that he hoped would raise the morale of the colony and bring back the settlement from the brink of economic collapse. He was convinced at this point there was no saving the Verein itself, but all of the people who were already there, he could still save them. He decided he was going to march into the land grants and make peace with the Comanches.
How the fuck did he think that was going to work?
Man, you're going to be so shocked by how this turns out.
It works. It works.
He and a small posse of surveyors and militia set off from New Braunfels in January 1847. So before we get into his meeting with the Comanches, we need to talk about one other thing. When he and his posse arrived in Fredericksburg, the halfway point between New Braunfels and the land grants, John discovered that the governor that he'd left there, the guy Dr. Schubert had heard about the mob a few weeks prior to that and decided he wanted to do the same thing. So he tried to rile up the citizens of Fredericksburg in order to overthrow Meusebach and to place him in command of the colony. This one was even less successful than the one in New Braunfels because nobody in Fredericksburg bit.
So he just fell face first in his attempt. Lovely.
Yeah, instead the people of Fredericksburg responded by having a mass signing of a document that publicly declared their support for John Meusebach. And so when he arrived into town, they greeted him with a cannon shot and threw a party for him.
Nice.
That guy, Dr. Schubert, it was discovered that his actual name was Frederick Struberg. Not Schubert, but Struberg. And he wasn't actually a doctor.
Surprising.
He did not have medical training. He was forced to flee town.
Good.
Yeah, good. Fuck this guy. He was forced to flee town, and he ended up taking up residence by squatting on a piece of land that was owned by the Verein, the organization itself, it was a plantation north of New Braunfels called the Nassau Plantation. He would end up staying in the Nassau Plantation for 2 years.
Damn.
Declaring himself the rightful Commissioner General of the colony, even though he didn't have access to any of the administration of the colony. And then finally, after 2 years, he was dislodged in a gunfight with Verein agents in 1848. He got into a gunfight, and that's what forced him to finally flee and give up.
Honestly, he sounds like a little punk.
He was a fucking punk. So after that, he moved to Arkansas, where he opened up a medical practice. Again, not a doctor, no medical training. But he opened up a medical practice. He bought a few slaves, lived there for a few years, and then ended up moving back to Germany and living out the rest of his life there, where he ended up becoming actually a pretty famous fiction author.
Did he write anything I would know, or
No, it was all in German. You wouldn't know any of it. But he was famous in Germany. But yeah, that's this. I wanted to put that in there because he's one of those just fucking weird people.
he's one of them weirdies?
Just yeah, just weird adventurers that pops up in American history in the 1800s for some reason.
I'm sure there's a bunch of weirdos that show up in American history that don't get talked about.
That's the entire premise of. Have I told you about the Dollop?
Nope.
It's an American history podcast that's run by two comedians, and they almost exclusively talk about like the weirdest fucking people in American history that nobody knows about.
That sounds kind of fun.
It is so funny. It's such a good podcast. I think you would really enjoy it. Yeah, so yeah, they have a party. Meusebach and his posse. They have a party in Fredericksburg, and then they set off again and approach the border of Comanche territory, which is the dividing line on the border is the Llano River. Their ultimate destination is several miles past the Llano River at Fort San Saba, which is an old Spanish fort. They crossed the Llano River into Comancheria in late January, only a few miles in, literally only a few miles, like the day that they cross. They are confronted by a group of Comanches. And it's a pretty tense situation, kind of a standoff sort of situation.
No shit.
At the head of the Comanches was a man named Ketamoxi. Ketamoxi was the chief of the Penateca band. So the way that the Comanches were set up, they weren't like one unified tribe. There were a whole bunch of like
Most tribes weren't, as far as I'm aware, right?
yeah, a lot of tribes have like a bunch of different subsections sorts of they're all under like the same name, like the same nation, but they have like different groupings. They're kind of sometimes they're like family units, other times they're just kind of uh like loose associations, but they're these different groups are called bands, and they're kind of tribes within tribes. And that's how the Comanches were set up. They had a whole bunch of different tribes or a whole bunch of different bands within the larger Comanche Empire. And this particular group was called the Penateca, with Ketamoxi as their chief. Going into this expedition, John had received letters both from the governor of Texas and from agents of the federal government warning him that this expedition would be suicide.
I mean, on paper, it sounds like suicide.
On paper, if based on everything that the settlers know, this should have been a suicide mission by all reasonable assumptions based on the knowledge that they had. The big reason being that the war with Mexico had, because all of the military strength of both Mexico and the US were kind of distracted, the Comanches saw it as a grand opportunity to go a plundering, which was true. There was a lot. The Comanches did take advantage of the situation. They did a lot of raiding all throughout Texas. Um, but in this particular situation, John and his party come up to Ketamoxi. John pulls out his rifle. He holds up his rifle and he fires it into the air. And a few of the people in his group think that that's like, what the fuck are you doing? You don't want to like provoke them. But the guys who are experienced with uh, like fighting against native people knew exactly what he was doing.
He was establishing dominance, I'm assuming. Or
No, he was not, because back then, rifles and muskets and stuff, they were you had to reload the chart. You had to
well, I'm aware. I assumed he just had guns ready behind him, carried by someone else.
no, it was just one rifle per man.
Interesting.
And so by firing off the one round he has loaded in his rifle, he is demonstrating that he is, after he fires, he's unarmed. And so he's sending the message to them like, I'm putting my well-being in your hands on the hope that we can have a peaceful interaction. That's the message that he's sending. And that's exactly the message that the Penteca take from that.
He's lucky they didn't just say, "Oh, fuck him. He's not defenseless. Kill him."
Well, that's what a lot of see, that's where the propaganda comes in. That's where like kind of the racism comes in, is that that's what people think they would have done. But
Well, I thought they were part of the Comanche and therefore warlike, right? Like they're a bunch of.
they were warlike. They were warlike, but they weren't just violent for the hell of it. That's not that is largely a like once they actually got into the raiding and the fighting, they were completely utterly ruthless. But outside of fighting, they were just normal people. And like if they didn't have a reason to fight, if they weren't provided with a reason to fight, they weren't going to fight.
I guess that's propaganda I need to unlearn or something.
Yeah, that's just an aspect of like learning about the it's just a part of like American culture. That's the perception that we have of like the more warlike nations.
Well, when I think of it doesn't matter if it's native or if it's like a historical group of people that like I see the Romans as mostly warlike, and I just it's one of those things you don't reconcile that. Oh, outside of war, they're probably not so bad, you know.
Yeah, they're at yeah, outside of war, they're just going to be normal people. Um, but yeah, so Ketamoxi and the rest of the Comanche there take this very well. They completely accept they completely accept these Germans. And one of John's friends, who was actually there at the time, said that Ketamoxi received the Germans in what he called, quote, a royal reception. Ketamoxi seemed to respect John's confidence. John was very, as we've already established, John is very cool headed. And during his discussion, like through interpreters, during his discussion, he kind of forced the Comanches to talk to him on an equal basis as one chief to another. So he was talking to Ketamoxi as one leader talking to another leader, not somebody coming to pay tribute or somebody in fear for their life. And this was very receptive to the Comanches, who very much respected like as a lot of warlike cultures, um they view like an attempt at submission as like weakness. So if you trying to diffuse a situation through humility is going to backfire with a people like the Comanches, because they'll see that as an opportunity. But if you stand, but what John was doing was he was standing and confronting them and demanding that he be treated as an equal. And that, and within Comanche culture, that kind of established him as an equal in their eyes. Just having the gall, with the reputation that the Comanches have, having the gall to be willing to do that was enough to earn their respect. And so this first meeting was actually a very, very good, successful meeting. They they had a meal together, they exchanged a few gifts, and they agreed that they would have another meeting to negotiate like a formal treaty between the Comanches and the Germans. That and that they would meet for this meeting at the San Saba fort on March 1st. Before they left, before the Germans headed back to prepare for this next meeting, uh, Ketamoxi and the other Comanches gave John a nickname. John, he had his bright red hair, and by this point he also had grown out his beard, which was just as bright red as his head hair was. Ketamoxi gave him the nickname El Colorado Sol.
Where did El Colorado Soul come from?
El Colorado Sol is Spanish for the red sun. And the red sun it's a reference to two things. It's a reference to his hair, which is bright red,
I kind of assumed at least the hair was a part of it.
but it's also the sun in Comanche culture is a representation of fatherhood and leadership. And so when they call him a son, they're saying that he's a great chief.
Okay.
And so another it's the directly from Spanish, El Colorado Sol is the red sun, but through the lens of Comanche culture, it could also be translated as um, like the red great chief or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they met again in March. It was attended by the chiefs of several other Comanche bands, and the negotiations were directed by Meusebach and Ketamaxi. The treaty that they made, which came to be called the Comanche Meusebach Treaty, very creative, it specified that the German settlers would have free travel throughout all Comanche land, that they would be allowed to settle on the land grants, that any crime that was committed either by a Comanche or a German against somebody from the other group would be appropriately tried by their own nation's respective laws, and also that the Texas Germans and the Comanche people would share friendship for the rest of time. That was the fifth provision. Like we are
Interesting.
our two people will be friends for the rest of time. The Comanche Moisabach Treaty is the only treaty ever made between Native people in America and a private entity not associated with any American government.
Dang.
Yep. It is also believed to be the only treaty made between white settlers and a native nation that has never been broken.
Wow.
To this day, it has not, that treaty still stands unbroken. The friendship of the Texas Germans and the Comanche people still lives on paper.
I That's one thing about history that really ticks me off about the US government is we went and took native land. It's a fact you have to accept because it happened. But then we made deals with them that we refused to honor. And that I'm very I hate when you don't honor um uh your word, or however you want to put that.
Yeah. Yeah. Honor contracts.
Well, it's not even just contracts. If you say you're going to do something, do it to your best.
Yeah. Like contract in a general term, like not just on paper, but like agreements.
Yes. That's one of my pet peeves is not honoring agreements, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's I've read a little bit of a book called "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee," which is just like it's a historical anthology relating a whole bunch of stories of uh, native conflict with the U.S. government throughout uh, American history, especially during like the Plains Indian Wars of like from like the 1850s through like the 1880s, and every single one of those conflicts, I can't think of any off the top of my head that didn't start this way. Every single one of them started with with the federal government breaking a contract it had made with a nation.
I mean, that's about the McGirt ruling. It's literally saying, "Hey, we didn't you guys didn't really get this land correctly, so technically since you broke those contracts, it reverts back to native, even if we're going to keep the state boundaries the same."
Yeah, and that opens up a big can of worms for the US government, because if they start actually enforcing like already broken treaties, they're going to start reverting a whole lot of like
I think the McGirt was very, in a very specific sense. McGirt only reverted, basically in a way where like criminal penalties revert to native court, basically.
yeah, tribal courts gain precedence over like certain specific uh, local, county, or federal jurisdictions in certain situations, something like that.
And I think they've already kind of like crippled it with the recently. I don't know the details, but I know it's not really getting enforced as much as it was at first.
So now, now all of that land, all of the land grants, they're freed up now. They're free and open to settlement. And so one of the first settlements that ends up actually getting established within the land grants is, I guess it's a town. I'll call it a town. It's a town called Bettina. Bettina was the brainchild of a collection of radical intellectuals from the city of Darmstadt. And these guys called themselves the Society of 40. The Society of 40 were part of the really, really early communist movement. So yeah, we're getting some communism into the story too.
It wouldn't be something written by you if it wasn't mentioned in some form.
But this was back before communism as we know it, like Marxism.
I was about to say it's probably not anything like I understand it to be.
Yeah, this is more it's it's what's called utopian communism. So this strand of communists are more concerned with setting up and establishing like utopian communities rather than trying to wage revolution. They're trying to change society by establishing these communities that can serve as like the blueprints for new formations within society that can be reformed into practice in larger society. And then Karl Marx came in and he monopolized communism as like class struggle, and that comes a little later. This community, Bettina, was named in honor of a woman back in Germany named Bettina von Arnim, who was one of Germany's first prominent feminists and was a close family friend of the Meusebachs. This commune lasted a year because, as it turns out, a bunch of snobby professors from a big city don't actually know how to farm. And so their community failed pretty quickly. In fact, most of the settlements in the land grants themselves didn't actually last that long. So it's this really weird situation. People are moving in and they're settling their farms and their ranches and stuff, but the actual towns, the actual communities that are supposed to pop up around them don't last.
Weird.
So the only German settlement in the area in the land grants which lasted any length of time was the town of Castell, which was obviously named after Count Castell, the leader of the Verein. Castell, for a little while, it was the capital of Llano County, but today the town is unincorporated and has a population of 104 people.
Do you mean the county seat rather than the capital?
Yeah, county seat. That's what I meant.
Okay, I was so confused for a second.
Yeah, count. I was confused. Yeah, I got counties don't have capitals. I don't know what I'm thinking. The county seat.
I was so confused for a second, Derek. I was like, counties have capitals? Where the fuck have I been?
No, Castell was the seat of Llano County at the time, and then it still technically exists, but it's unincorporated. And today it has a population of 104 people. I think like 90% of the town is over the age of 80.
Damn, that is old as fuck.
Yeah, and the big reason why so many of these settlements failed was because all of the German settlers wanted to stick close to Fredericksburg. Because as it turns out, the settlers in Fredericksburg were kicking ass. Fredericksburg got became self-sufficient so quickly. Like the people there immediately figured out, oh, well, these if we don't have the necessary tools, we can kind of make substitutes for the tools, or we can use these particular materials for building our homes. That we don't need these particular tools. They started using local materials like the limestone and like I think even some of the early buildings use like pueblo, just like dried mud and stuff like that. Um, Even today, a lot of people note that like the historic buildings, the historic architecture in Fredericksburg is this fascinating mix of like classic German architecture, like from Germany, but all kind of mixed with like using local materials like pueblo and limestone that give it just this completely unique, fascinating look. And it's because of the ingenuity in coming up with this stuff that Fredericksburg was able to pop up and begin thriving so quickly compared to so many other German settlements. And even today, Fredericksburg is still the largest, the largest city in the hill country.
Damn.
It's a very, very successful town. So John, he sent his he got all of this done. All of this, he's left he's left the colony in a pretty good position. Now, they're getting to the point they're starting to grow crops. They're starting to get some returns, some funding's coming in. The stuff that's going to the Varine itself is just, you might as well be throwing it in the trash. But the stuff that they're keeping, um, is going a long way towards alleviating a lot of the problems. So John sent his resignation to the Varine in January. The following July, he receives word back that his resignation has been accepted, and his successor would be this guy named Hermann Spies, who was actually the leader of those communists I told you about, the Darmstadt Society of 40.
Interesting.
John had bought a plot of land and built a ranch in an area called Comanche Springs, about halfway between New Braunfels and Fredericksburg. But he intended, before he actually settled down, he intended to take a trip to Germany so that he could marry his fiancee and bring her to live their new life in the Texas Hill Country. Without Meusebach at the helm, the Verein began to fall apart.
No shit.
No shit, yeah. Nobody else was capable of managing the finances that John had propped up. And back in Germany, mismanagement and a whole bunch of petty arguments within the Verein itself ended up pushing the company over the edge into insolvency. It would end up limping along for a little bit. At one point, it was reincorporated and renamed the German Emigration Company, which is another like popular name you'll see it called today. But the weight of the debt and the resulting lawsuits from creditors forced it to disband and have its assets sold off in 1853. But by that point, the land was already settled. Thanks to John's work and his treaty with the Comanches, all of the German colonists were successfully settled, and in the fall of 1847, they were bringing in their first successful harvest. John Meusebach couldn't save the Verein, but he did save the colonists. So, in late 1847, as he made his preparations to return to Europe, he sent a letter to his fiancée, Elizabeth von Hardenberg, letting her know that he was coming back and to ask her when she would like the date of the wedding to be. He received a reply back, and the letter that he got back was framed in black. Do you know what that means in like old?
I'm assuming she found someone else.
No.
She died?
The letter was from Elizabeth's family. She had died of typhoid fever.
Fuck.
Yeah. A couple weeks after that, he received another letter, also framed in black. This time it was from his own family. His father had died
Damn.
right around the same time that Elizabeth had.
That had to have been devastating.
It was really bad. The way it was described, he found solace in the fact that he had the weight of the colony. Now that he didn't have the responsibilities anymore, he had the weight of the colony lifted off his shoulders, and he was able to spend a little time on his ranch just enjoying nature, and it really helped him relax and get himself in a good state of mind. That's the way it was described.
I mean, yeah.
So it was obviously devastating for him, but he bounced back pretty quickly. He was really eager to see his family again, his mother and his siblings, but he ended up having to postpone his visit to Germany. The reason for that was because of the revolutions of 1848. Have you ever heard of the revolutions of 1848?
Nope.
Revolutions of 48 were a mass uprising across all of Europe. Protests turned into riots, riots turned into raids on castles and palaces. All over Europe, the symbols and the symbols of authority and wealth and power of the nobility were being burned to the ground by mobs of angry peasants and workers and students and things like that. They were demanding repeals of the reactionary repression of the post-Napoleonic age, and they were demanding the adoption of national constitutions. Some of these revolutions, including where the revolution started in France, were successful. Others were very much not so, especially in Germany. There ended up in 1848, there was this enormous influx of German immigrants. Like the second wave saw the arrival of 4,500 settlers. This next wave was like 10,000.
Damn.
And they were all either refugees or exiles who had participated in the revolutions of 48. So literally just 10,000 revolutionaries coming and making up the bulk of the people who would create the Texas German culture. Which I don't know, speaking as a leftist, I think that's pretty neat.
I mean, it's pretty. It is.
So, in the meantime, while he wasn't able to visit Germany because of all the violence, John ended up spending a lot of his free time helping a lot of these refugees find land and settle down for themselves. A good portion of them ended up moving back to Germany when they were able to, but a larger portion ended up just staying in Texas. He was finally able to take his trip back to Germany in 1851, 6 years after he had arrived in Texas.
Damn.
He was supposed to be there for 2 years.
His time there tripled.
He was overjoyed to see his mother and his siblings again, as well as meet several of his nieces and nephews for the first time. But he was also very disturbed by the state of politics in Europe after the revolutions. It was even more reactionary than when he left. When he left, it seemed like liberalism was starting to make progress. There was a large cadre of leadership within like the intelligentsia and amongst organizers on the ground. There were a lot of people making pushes for like constitutions and liberal government and things like that. But when he came back in 51, all of that was gone. All of the most energetic reformers in Germany were either dead, imprisoned, or exiled. And any headway that liberalism had been making it just didn't exist anymore. It was all reaction. So that was very disheartening. But while he was in Germany for about 4 months, he planned on staying longer. But then he received some news in the mail that seemed to confirm that his home and where he belonged was in Texas. And you're not going to believe this shit.
Do tell.
A letter came informing him that he had been elected to the Texas State Senate.
What?
Representing the 22nd District, which encompassed Bexar, Comal, and Medina counties, all majority German counties. He had not submitted his own candidacy, and he had not run a campaign. He was just elected. Everybody just decided to vote for him.
He's a lucky son bitch.
He left his mark. He left his mark on the Texas Germans. They recognized his leadership and they recognized the sacrifices that he made, and that he was a large part of why they didn't all die on the banks of the Gulf of Mexico. And so he had to end up cutting his trip to see his family short. He rushed back to take office and take his new position, and he took his oath of office on November 7th, 1851. He would never set foot in Germany again. He was in Texas for good now. His first act in Texas politics was making a motion that the printings of the newly elected governor's inaugural address would be published in German and Spanish, as well as in English.
Hella progressive.
Yeah, it was, and it passed. He gave a convincing argument, and it actually passed. Like back then, I'm not to say that there wasn't racism. There was very obviously racism in the state of Texas in 1851, but if you told the state Congress of Texas, hey, we've got a lot of immigrants and Mexic a lot of like foreign immigrants and Mexicans here who don't speak English. Maybe we should include them in the political process by printing this information on in languages that they'll understand. And they were all like, "Yeah, that seems reasonable."
Which would not happen today,
Which would absolutely not happen today.
which is shitty, but it wouldn't.
Which is yeah. John was appointed John was appointed as a member of the Committee on State Affairs and the Education Committee. The Education Committee, especially, is where he would really leave his mark in his very brief political career. During his 2-year term, he helped push through a bill that established Texas' public education system,
Nice.
which obviously it would require that all children under a certain age would have to attend a publicly funded school to get a basic primary education. And so that making him one of the founding fathers of public schooling in the state of Texas, which it actually kind of surprised me to find out Texas was one of the first states in the country to adopt public education, like compulsory public education for children.
That's crazy. Out of all the states that would have that, I wouldn't have never expected that.
Yeah, all the first ones were like up in New England, and then I think there were a couple like Midwest states, and then like Texas. Texas was definitely the first in the South. But yeah, it's a really really good thing. He drafted and successfully got passed legislations that confirmed the rights of the German colonists to the land that they had settled. So there had been a few concerns raised about like the legality of the German settlement. For one thing, the land grants were bought under the Republic of Texas government, which even though there should have been continuity, in a lot of instances there wasn't because of like mixes up in paperwork and things like that. And then for another thing, the bulk of the German settlers didn't settle in the grants themselves, and so it was speculated whether or not they actually had a right to colonize these large areas that were outside of their initial grants. And so John took care of that by ensuring that Congress recognized he's able to successfully get all of the land that had been settled by Germans successfully recognized by the state government.
Hell yeah.
And so none of these German settlers were at threat of being evicted from this land that they had sacrificed so much to be able to live off of. He also co-sponsored a bill which set aside public lands and funding in order to build a public university.
Interesting.
30 years later, that bill would finally culminate in the opening of the University of Texas in Austin.
Wow. So he helped found University of Texas.
Although speaking as an Aggie, that's a black mark against his legacy. So
Okay, it's still impressive to have a university because of your actions.
I know. I grew up with Texas A&M football, and I spent a year at Texas A&M. So I'm kind of obliged to shit on the University of Texas at any moment any opportunity I get. So
I mean, I grew up in a shitty small town near Stillwater, so I'm like, I have to shit on OU, even though I don't give a shit.
yeah, hell, I'll join you for that. I don't like OU.
OU's just like a pompous asshole college in like spirit, like at least in their sports. I'll
Yeah, UT is the OU of Texas. Yeah. Yeah. So the last big thing that he did while he was in office was he supported a bill which incorporated the Texas Rangers, which the Texas Rangers had been formed initially during the Texas Revolution as like a cavalry detachment for like the Texas military.
Okay.
And it had slowly evolved into like an impromptu militia that would fight against Comanche raids. And that's kind of been what it's been used for up to this point. John supported a bill which incorporated the Texas Rangers as the state's primary law enforcement agency.
Yeah, isn't the Texas Rangers basically their version of the OSBI?
Yeah,
I mean, in modern context, obviously.
yeah. Today, the Texas Rangers are still like the FBI of the state of Texas. Yeah, so he supported a bill that incorporated the Texas Rangers as the state's law enforcement agency, and that was largely motivated by one of his closest friends was actually an American. His name was Colonel Jack Hayes, who had served with the Texas Rangers since the Texas Revolution and was like this, like all across the United States, was like this nationally famous, in the nomenclature of the time, an Indian fighter. He was famous for his exploits fighting the Comanches and other different tribes all across the West. One of those guys. He's kind of like established the stereotype of like the Western like gunslinger, and he was one of John's best friends, and ended up becoming like the one of the first early leaders of the fully incorporated Texas Rangers.
That's sick that he kind of led to the Texas Rangers becoming what they are today.
Yeah, he didn't play. He wasn't like a an author or a co-sponsor of the bill, but he was a pretty vocal supporter of it. Which, you know, the Texas Rangers have their own history, but I won't get into that right now. So John left office in 1853. It was a 2-year stint, and at this point, he had served. He had done his service to the Texas German community. He had spent 8 years of his life giving all of his time to making sure that these people lived. And now he was finally going to take the chance to settle down. He took up his home in Comanche Springs and he began working on his old passions of botany and geology. He cataloged dozens of local plants, flowers, animals, stuff like that. He was sending specimens to his colleagues both in Texas and also back in Germany, especially at the University of Halle. John met and married the daughter of one of his friends, a girl named Agnes von Corinth. Agnes had immigrated to Texas from Austria with her parents when she was 11 years old.
How old was she when they married?
17.
And how old was he?
40.
That's disgusting.
Yeah, that's not good. uh, yeah, they got married in 1852. They stayed married for the rest of their lives. They would end up having 11 kids together.
That's entirely too many kids.
That is entirely too many kids. Two to
2 to 3 is the max I would ever consider.
They had 3 sons and 8 daughters.
Holy shiznit.
4 of the daughters would end up dying as children.
Ooh.
Which, yeah, that's not great. But the Civil War years were hard on the Meusebach family. In the late 1850s, John sold the Comanche Springs farm in order to start a business in Fredericksburg so that he could take care of his enormous family. But when the war started, the Southern economy crashed because they no longer had access to, trade with the North, and they were now using the glorified monopoly money that was the Confederate dollar. And so John ended up being forced to bounce around the area, around the hill country, looking for odd jobs while he was also running his store, just in order to make ends meet. The Civil War turned out to be hard on all Texas Germans. The first waves of the Germans, way back in the early 40s, came from the backgrounds of liberal academics. And the later waves after 1848 were exiled revolutionaries. And so the German community in Texas were a little bit more progressive on average than their Anglo neighbors. And almost to a man, Texas Germans hated slavery. They despised it. And beyond that, they saw the American system as their liberation from the oppression of like the European aristocratic system. And so they had a very deep loyalty to the Union. They loved the United States. In the Texas state referendum, deciding on secession. The only counties in Texas that voted a majority against secession were the ones that were majority German.
That tracks.
During the war, protests broke out in German towns when the Confederate troops came to begin drafting Germans into the rebel army. In response to these protests, the Hill Country was put under martial law. During the occupation, several Germans were summarily executed either by firing squad or by hanging for minor offenses. I think one of them was just a guy like called a Confederate officer like a dirty name.
That sounds like the South.
They ended up hanging him. Local Confederate supporters began forming mobs, like the local Nate uh, Anglo like born in America Americans who supported the Confederacy. They began forming mobs, which would attack, harass, and in some cases lynched German citizens. One group of Germans, about 60 or so, attempted to flee south to the Rio Grande River over the border into Mexico with the intent of smuggling themselves into Union occupied New Orleans so that they could enlist in the Union Army. As they were trying to leave, they were ambushed by Confederate troops at the Nueces River. A brief firefight ensued, and those Germans who weren't killed in the attack ended up becoming captured and were summarily executed. The Germans who were wounded were all killed by bayonets. This mass killing came to be called, by Southern sympathizers, it was called the Battle of the Nueces. But to people like me, who, these were my people, it's the Nueces Massacre.
I mean, that's all you can really call it, to be honest. It's not. That's not a battle.
Yeah, they weren't combatants. They hadn't joined any army yet. They hadn't taken up arms against the Confederacy. They were just trying to get to Mexico as far as the Confederates knew. But they were Germans. They didn't speak English. They were immigrants, and they were Union sympathizers, and that was enough to take their lives. John Meusebach, for his part, was a bit torn over the war. On the one hand, just like every other German in the Hill Country, he was very loyal to the United States, and he hated slavery. And so he supported the Union morally. But on the other hand, he had this weird respect for Southern troops. He didn't begrudge them. He didn't see them as evil, or he thought that they were fighting for an evil cause, but he didn't see them as inherently evil themselves. He saw them as courageous men suffering and dying for a cause that they believed in, even if he didn't agree with that cause. And so he had a lot of sympathy for them. And a lot of that might have been inspired by the fact that his wife Agnes had 3 brothers who served in the Confederate Army, 2 of which ended up being killed in combat.
Ugh.
So, yeah, complicated situation. He was a staunch, hardcore Union Union supporter and abolitionist, but he was still understandably morally torn up because a lot of the people that were going to fight for the Confederacy, there were like a handful of Germans that went to fight for the Confederacy, but there were a lot of Americans that he knew that went and fought, and he still loved them even if he didn't agree with their cause, and he still worried about their well-being. So I understand where it is he's coming from.
Definitely.
Nevertheless, he was very happy to see slavery abolished and the country reunited at the end of the war in 1865. In 1867, he sold his business in Fredericksburg, and he bought another small farm at a place called Waco Springs on the Guadalupe River, 3 miles north of New Braunfels. He named the farm Loyal Springs, which was in reference to the loyal part of that name comes from his loyalty to the Union during the Civil War. He wanted to enshrine that idea. Life was good. It was pretty quiet. It was occasionally broken up by a natural disaster. A tornado destroyed the farmhouse in 1869. Nobody was killed, but his leg was crushed by a wooden beam, which left him with a limp for the rest of his life.
Damn.
They rebuilt, but then their second home was destroyed in a flood in 1872. They rebuilt again. Their third house was destroyed in a fire in 1886.
They just can't catch a break.
After the after the third house was destroyed, John told his family, quote, "We overcame two other terrible losses. We'll manage a third. This new house will be made entirely of rock."
Can't blame him. Cannot blame him.
The rest of his life was very quiet. He didn't get up to much. He was just tending his farm, had a few cattle, spent a lot of time continuing his scientific research, documenting, cataloging rocks and geological formations and animals and plants. He saw his children and then his grandchildren all raised in the home at Loyal Springs, and he lived long enough to see the 50th anniversary of the founding of New Braunfels and of Fredericksburg. The day after his 85th birthday, May 27th, 1897, he passed away from old age in his bed, surrounded by family in Loyal Springs. His tombstone bears his German family's motto, Tenax Propositi, and his new motto that he took for his Texas family, Texas Forever. Texas Germans, and especially John Meusebach's leadership, left an indelible mark on the state of Texas. In culture, politics, and economics, the German settlers played an enormous role in the development of the Texas that we know it as today.
And it's baffling to me that that's not like more widely known.
Yeah, it's today, even in Texas, the fact that Germans even were a part that German settlement was even a part of Texas history is just like an incidental footnote, like a little factoid that you tell, like, hey, did you know that Texas had like this big population of like Texas or of Germans, and that there's still a dialect of German that's still spoken in some parts of Texas. It's just a little factoid, and it's not given the weight of like the actual effect that they had in shaping the state into what it is today, especially because of the actions and the leadership of John Meusebach. On top of being the savior of the Texas German community, he was also one of the state's leaders in the creation of a public education system. And he was one of the founding fathers of the scientific study of Texas environment and geography, thanks to his decades of study and field research. Most of what we know about Texas ecology and geology are have its roots as foundations in the research that he did. During the First and Second World Wars, fear of German infiltration in the country motivated the federal government and the Texas state government to pass laws which restricted the speaking and the teaching of German and the practice of German culture. Especially during World War I, Germans in America faced discrimination and vigilante violence. People would be beaten in the street, have their businesses vandalized. There were a couple lynchings just all across the country. This was happening to Germans anywhere. To avoid persecution, many Texas Germans changed their names, or they changed the names of streets in their town, or they even changed their town names. Anything that had a German sounding name, a lot of those names were changed to sound less German. A lot of people, a lot of families named Schmidt changed their name to Smith so that people wouldn't suspect them of being like sympathizers of the Kaiser or of Adolf Hitler, even though almost pretty much to a man, these people were completely loyal to the United States and never considered themselves anything less than Americans.
It's quite sad that anytime something happens from an outside force here in America, we demonize the people who are descended from that region or had moved from that region. Like, there's the concentration camps we kept for the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. You can talk about brain went blank, but I know there's more. We demonized the Germans after Hitler. We did a lot of stupid shit, and you can 9/11 and Muslims. It's bullshit.
Yeah, it just keeps happening. And like it by 1917, when the US entered World War One, my family had been in the United States for 4 or 5 generations by that point. It had been almost a century since a single member of my family had even set foot in Germany. And that was the case for most of the people involved. who suffered because of these policies. And so because of all of this suppression, both by vigilante violence, by mob violence, and by just state legislation by the state, Texas Germans, to protect their own children, they just stopped teaching their children German. They just raised their children to speak English and didn't pass on German culture to the next generation. And so by 1950, there were less than 100 new German speakers amongst the Texas Germans. Today, there are about 5 or 6 thousand native speakers of the Texas dialect of German, which has come to be called Texas Deutsch. And all of these native speakers are all elderly and dying out.
It's sad, to be honest. It's like it's even sad no matter what. Like I think learning more than one language is invaluable because it gives you a different perspective, and seeing so many people not getting the chance when they have a cultural reason to is horrible, to be honest.
But thanks to the work of people like this guy named Dr. Hans Bose, who's a professor of linguistics at the University of Texas, and thanks to like the German Texan Heritage Society, which is based out of Austin, Texas German culture and the language, the unique Texas specific dialect of German, is being preserved, and they're doing things like hosting classes to teach Texas German and hosting festivals to teach about the unique German cultural imports that have been practiced in the Texas Hill Country but have been lost to time. And they're preserving it, and they're starting to spread it. They're starting to provide access to it to new generations so that people, German descended people in Texas, are now able to reconnect with that culture which was strangled out of us.
Good.
And so, and also before we head out, do you know who the most famous Texas German in American history was?
No, I like I said, I really didn't know anything about Texas German until you had mentioned it to me in passing.
You might have heard this guy's name before. He was the commander of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific during World War II. Admiral Chester Nimitz.
It sounds familiar, but I'm drawing a blank right now.
Yeah, he was born in Fredericksburg. His ancestors, his great grandfather's name, that petition that I told you about when John Meusebach came into Fredericksburg after the failed coup attempt.
Yeah.
The petition, one of the names on there is Chester Nimitz's great grandfather, and Nimitz went on to become one of the primary military leader one of the primary military leaders of the American war effort in World War II. So yeah, and today the Chester Nimitz Museum is still open and really popular in Fredericksburg. I thought I'd mention that. I thought it was pretty cool. But the sources that I used for this were a book, John O. Meusebach, German Colonizer in Texas by Irene Marshall King, and several different articles from the Texas State Historical Association. So, also that book, Irene Marshall King, was actually a granddaughter of John Meusebach, and she was an academic. She was an English professor at Baylor University, and she spent the later years of her career researching and the early settlement of Germans in Texas and the life of her grandfather, John Meusebach. And it's thanks to a lot of her scholarship that we know this much about him. I don't know. What are you thinking about, Tim? What are your thoughts?
It's kind of crazy to think that there's that much of Texas history that's not widely known, to be honest. Because I would have, if it weren't for you, I would know nothing about the Texas German history, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I didn't even know about it until about a year ago. I didn't know a thing about Texas Germans, even though I'm descended from them.
I've already kind of said some like general thoughts already as we were kind of wrapping up, so I don't really have a whole lot much more. It's kind of crazy that this one guy who's not quote unquote historically relevant, like not a big person at least, had that big of an impact on Texas. And you could argue Texas probably wouldn't be the same as it is today if it weren't for him.
Yeah, it absolutely would not be the same state that it is today if it hadn't been for Germans in Texas. And that's a I don't know if this I know that a lot of Americans don't really care about like their like they'll know like yeah I'm like I'm descended from English or Scots or Irish or Dutch or whatever, but I hold like my German heritage. I hold a very special place for it in my heart, and I care very deeply about it. And I think I want more people to know like this story.
Definitely.
Tim, what's all that stuff you usually plug?
They can find me at Twitter at Tim, aka Otis. Where can they find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The first I is a 1, the O is a 0, and yeah.
And if you're looking to follow the podcast, you can find it at Twitter at Alex Society Pod, and then on Facebook and Instagram at The Alexander Society Pod. If you enjoyed what you've heard, please leave a rate and review on your favorite streaming platform of choice.
Frohes Oktoberfest.